Deep in the shadowed folds of the Ozark Mountains, where the trees whispered secrets older than the hills themselves, there stood a forgotten springhouse. Its weathered stones, slick with moss and the perpetual drip of mineral-rich water, hid more than just a source of life-giving liquid. For generations, locals spoke in hushed tones about the three sisters who dwelled nearby, identical in their pale, ethereal beauty, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian under the moon's gaze. They were the Triplet Witches, though no one dared call them that to their faces. Instead, tales circulated in dimly lit bars and around flickering campfires, how they lured wayward souls with voices that slithered through the night like fog, promising warmth, desire, and an end to the aching loneliness that plagued the hearts of single men in these remote hollows. It began subtly, as these things often do. A traveler named Elias, weary from the endless road and the weight of his solitary life, pulled over on a rain-slicked county lane one autumn evening. The engine of his old pickup sputtered to a halt, and in the silence that followed, he heard it, a faint melody, carried on the wind like the sigh of a lover long lost. It tugged at him, pulling him from the cab and into the underbrush, where thorns clawed at his jeans and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweeter, almost intoxicating. He followed the sound deeper into the woods, his flashlight beam dancing over gnarled roots and fallen leaves, until the springhouse emerged from the gloom like a relic from a forgotten dream. The sisters were waiting. Their voices intertwined in a harmony that made Elias's skin prickle, words that weren't quite words but promises all the same. "Come," they murmured, their forms silhouetted against the faint glow emanating from the spring's depths. "Drink from our well, and find what you've been seeking." Elias stepped closer, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and inexplicable yearning. He didn't know then that he was the 35th man to heed that call, nor that the others had vanished without a trace, their echoes lingering only in the dark recesses of the forest. As he knelt by the bubbling water, the sisters' hands, cold and insistent, guided him, and the world outside faded into irrelevance. But in the quiet moments before the ritual truly began, a chill wind stirred the leaves, carrying faint cries from the depths below, voices trapped in eternal torment, hinting at the horrors yet to unfold. Deep in the oldest part of the Ozarks, where the ridges fold in on themselves like the knuckles of a clenched fist, the three sisters lived in a cabin no map had ever bothered to mark. They had been born together on a night when a blood moon hung low and red over the hollow, and from that moment the mountain seemed to claim them as its own. People in the scattered towns below simply called them the Triplets, though no one could remember the last time any of the sisters had walked into a store, a church, or a courthouse. They were ageless in the way only isolation and rumor can make someone ageless, skin pale as river birch, hair the deep black of wet slate, and eyes that caught whatever light dared to reach them and threw it back sharper, colder, older. Folks said their mother had been the same kind of strange, and their grandmother before her, stretching back to the days when Cherokee and Osage still moved through these hills and left offerings at certain springs to keep something sleeping. The family never married outsiders, never needed to. Every generation produced 3 daughters, always 3, always identical, always born under the same crimson moon. When the mother finally passed, always quietly, always alone, the new triplets took her place without ceremony, as if the mountain simply exhaled one breath and inhaled another. The old stories claimed the women carried a power that wasn't exactly witchcraft in the storybook sense, but something older, hungrier, rooted in the limestone bones of the earth itself. They could make the trees lean a little closer when they walked beneath them. They could coax a wounded deer to lie still while they stroked its flank and whispered it into sleep. And when the nights grew long and the hollows filled with frost, their voices could drift farther than any human voice had a right to travel, threading through the pines like smoke looking for a chimney. Most people treated the tales like campfire garnish, spooky, yes, but harmless. Others crossed themselves when the wind shifted and carried a faint, 3-part harmony from the high ridges. Children were warned never to follow singing after dark, never to drink from an unfamiliar spring, never to answer when a woman's voice called your name 3 times in perfect unison. Yet the triplets themselves were rarely seen, only felt, and sudden hush in the woods, the scent of moonflowers where none should grow, the feeling of being watched by something that had already decided whether you were worth keeping. To the scattered farms and dying towns below, they were less people than weather, a cold front that had lingered for centuries, beautiful from a distance, dangerous if you stepped too close. The first time the voices found a man who truly listened, it was late October and the ridges were bleeding color into the hollers below. Jack Taggart, 38, twice divorced, drifting from one logging camp to the next with nothing but a duffel and a bottle of cheap whiskey, had parked his rusted Chevy at the dead end of Old Mill Trace because the engine coughed itself to death and he was too tired to curse it anymore. Night came down fast the way it does in the mountains, sudden as a slammed door, and the silence that followed was so complete he could hear his own pulse knocking against his ears. He stepped out to piss against a pine, and that was when he heard it, a low, honeyed murmur rising from somewhere deeper in the woods than any road had ever gone. At first he thought it was the wind combing through the hollows, making that mournful sound the pines sometimes give up when they're old and half-rotten. But the sound shaped itself into words, 3 strands of the same voice braided together so tightly they felt like one. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It slid under his skin the way warm bourbon slides down a cold throat, promising things he hadn't let himself want in years. Companionship. Touch that didn't ask questions. A bed that wasn't the narrow bench seat of a pickup. Someone, 3 someones, who already knew his name and said it like they'd been waiting tables for him all his lonely life. Jack laughed once, short and bitter, because he'd heard every kind of siren before, barstool promises, late-night texts, the lie of wedding vows, but this was different. This wasn't a voice trying to sell him anything. It was a voice remembering him, calling him home to a place he'd never seen. The whiskey buzz left him all at once, replaced by something sharper, cleaner, like stepping into cold creek water and feeling every cut you forgot you had. He left the truck door hanging open, keys still in the ignition, and started walking. The beam of his dying flashlight jittered across Laurel and Deadfall, but he didn't need it. The dark felt welcoming now, almost soft. With every step the voices grew sweeter, threading through the trees in perfect, impossible unison, telling him he was almost there, just a little farther, just past the next rise where the spring ran clear and the night smelled of crushed mint and something darker underneath. Jack pushed through a final curtain of cedar and the Springhouse rose out of the ground like something the mountain had decided to remember. Moonlight slid across its mossy roof and down the stones, turning the trickling water silver. The air here was warmer than it had any right to be in late October, thick with the smell of wet limestone and crushed herbs he couldn't name. And there they stood, barefoot on the slick flagstones, 3 women who were the same woman repeated until the world couldn't tell the difference anymore. They wore plain cotton dresses the color of old bone, sleeves pushed high, hair loose and black as creek water at midnight. When they turned toward him the movement was one movement, 3 bodies answering the same invisible string. Their faces were heartbreakingly lovely in the way a winter sky is lovely, clean, cold, indifferent until you realize it's looking straight through you. 6 eyes caught the moonlight and held it, pupils wide and depthless, reflecting Jack like he was already something they owned. The voices that had tugged him through miles of darkness were suddenly inside the small clearing, no longer drifting on the wind but pouring from 3 mouths at once, soft and intimate, as though each sister spoke directly into a different chamber of his heart. Jack, they said, tasting the name like it was something sweet they'd been saving. You kept us waiting. He tried to answer, something about the truck, the cold, how he hadn't meant to come this far, but the words tangled and died. The tallest, or maybe they were all the same height, stepped forward, bare feet silent on the wet stone, and laid her palm flat against his chest. Her hand was cool, but the pressure went straight through coat and shirt and skin until he felt it on the raw muscle of his heart. The other 2 circled, slow, unhurried, fingers brushing his sleeves, the nape of his neck, the stubble along his jaw. Every touch left a trail of static that tasted like copper and lilac. You're tired, the one at his chest murmured, and the other 2 echoed it a breath behind, the harmony so perfect it made the hairs on his arms rise. Let us take that from you. They drew him closer to the low stone rim of the spring. The water inside was black and shining, moving in slow circles though nothing stirred it. Their reflections floated there, 3 pale faces, and now a 4th beginning to form as Jack leaned over the edge, and for a moment he thought he saw something else beneath the surface, pale limbs tangled like roots, eyes wide and waiting. The sisters pressed against him from every side now, a cage of soft breath and colder hands, guiding his face down toward the water while their voices braided tighter, promising the only thing a man like Jack had ever truly wanted, to never be alone again. Years before Jack Taggart ever heard the voices, the Springhouse had already been drinking men. The first stones were laid in the 1790s by a French trapper who vanished the same winter, leaving behind a journal written in frantic script about les trois filles du diable, who bathed naked in the water and sang in languages that hurt to hear. Cherokee hunters avoided the seep long before that, calling it Stotsin Via, the place where the water remembers. They said something ancient had been trapped beneath the limestone when the world was still soft, something that wanted daughters the way drought wants rain. By the war between the states the spring had a roof and a reputation. Confederate deserters, Union scouts, runaway slaves, anyone desperate enough to cut through the deep hollows, sometimes found the clearing at night. Those who drank walked out changed, eyes too bright, speaking in low voices about beautiful sisters who shared one shadow. Most never reached the next ridge. Their rifles turned up later, barrels stuffed with wild mint, stocks carved with tiny interlocking circles that made surveyors dizzy when they tried to copy them. After Reconstruction, the Springhouse passed into the keeping of the first documented triplet line. A midwife from Taney County delivered 3 girls at once to a woman who had no husband and no past anyone could trace. The mother raised them on deer milk and silence, teaching them to read the rings inside a walnut shell, to call foxfire from rotten logs, to braid their voices until the sound could slide between a man's thoughts like a needle through cloth. When the mother finally walked into the spring one frost morning and did not come out, the daughters simply stepped into her place. The mountain accepted the exchange without comment. Over the decades the pattern repeated, always 3, always born beneath a blood moon, always taking up residence in the same sagging cabin a rifle shot from the Springhouse. They kept no livestock, no garden anyone ever saw, yet smoke always rose from their chimney and their dresses stayed spotless. Travelers who glimpsed them from a distance swore the women never aged. A photograph taken in 1938 by a WPA writer showed the same faces that stared out from a tintype dated 1887. The spring itself grew clearer with each generation, tasting faintly of iron and something floral that lingered on the tongue like a half-remembered dream. Men who drank once came back if they could, scratching at their own doors at night, begging wives and mothers to let them return to the water. Those who couldn't come back were simply never heard from again, their names joining a quiet roll call carved by unseen hands into the underside of the Springhouse roof beams, 34 shallow grooves, waiting for the 35th. The disappearances began to braid themselves into the ordinary fabric of the counties the way kudzu climbs a telephone pole, slow at first, then all at once. A long-haul trucker from Springfield told his dispatcher he was stopping for coffee on Highway 65 and never keyed the mic again. His rig was found idling on the shoulder with the cab door open and a half-eaten honey bun cooling on the dash. 2 weeks later, a deer hunter from Branson kissed his wife goodbye on a Saturday dawn, promising to be home by dark with a 10-point buck. His blaze orange vest turned up months later snagged high in a sweet gum tree, no blood, no bullet holes, just the faint smell of moonflowers clinging to the fabric. By the spring of the following year the count was 9. Then 16. Always single men, always traveling alone, always last seen heading east on some lonesome blacktop that bent toward the deeper hollows. Their vehicles formed a strange constellation along the back roads, pickups, motorcycles, once a gleaming Harley with Arkansas plates left gleaming under a cedar like it had been parked for church. Inside every cab the story was the same, keys dangling, radios still whispering staticky country songs, wallets untouched on the seats. No signs of struggle, no spilled blood, only the lingering sense that the drivers had stepped out to answer a question no one else could hear. In the gas stations and feed stores people started comparing notes the way farmers compare frost dates. Every missing man had mentioned the same thing in the days before he vanished, a low singing in the woods at night, 3 voices woven so tightly they sounded like one. Some heard it from their own back porches, others while camped beside a creek, a few even claimed it drifted through the cracked window of a motel room on the edge of town. The melody never had words anyone could catch, only the feeling of words, invitation, hunger, home. Men who had never shown an ounce of poetry in their lives woke their buddies at 3 a.m. muttering about women made of moonlight waiting by cold water. Sheriff's deputies logged the reports with the weary patience of men who had chased more Bigfoot sightings than they cared to count, but even they began to notice how the voices always pulled in the same direction, up the ridgebacks, past the last cell tower, into the trackless heart of the Boston Mountains where even the search dogs refused to follow a trail. By the time the 35th empty truck was found, this one a white Ford with Missouri plates, parked neatly on a gravel spur as though its driver had simply decided to walk the rest of the way to wherever he was needed most, the counties had stopped pretending it was coincidence. The night air itself seemed to listen now, thick with anticipation, and somewhere far off in the dark the 3-part harmony rose again, patient as stone, certain of the next footstep it would summon. His name was Harlan Crow, 47, ex-state police, retired on a bad knee and a worse divorce, now scraping by on private work nobody else wanted. He rolled into the county seat on a gray Tuesday in March driving a dented silver Tacoma that still smelled faintly of gun oil and stale coffee. The sheriff met him in the parking lot with a manila folder thick as a Bible and a look that said he'd already stopped believing in happy endings. 35 missing men, all single, all gone clean off the map, no bodies, no blood, no ransom notes. Just trucks and the same half-told story about singing in the woods. The sheriff needed someone who didn't have to answer to voters or headlines, someone who could disappear himself if it came to that. Crow took the file to the Pine View Motel, spread the pages across a table sticky with old beer, and worked the way he always had, slow, methodical, angry at chaos. He mapped every abandoned vehicle on a topo, pinned the dates, noted the weather, the moon phase, the direction each man had been traveling. The pattern was so tight it felt obscene. All roads bent toward one unmarked hollow 30 miles east of nowhere, a place locals called Wolf House Ridge, though no house had stood there since the 1920s. The disappearances formed a perfect spiral, tightening with every year, the newest dot almost on top of a spring symbol someone had inked in brown 100 years ago. He talked to the families. Mothers who still set an extra plate. A bartender who swore one of the missing had stood at the counter humming a tune in three-part harmony he'd never known before. A teenage son who woke to find his father's boots lined up neat by the door, laces tied together like wedding rings. Crow listened without blinking, writing nothing down, letting the grief settle on him like dust. At night he drove the back roads with the windows down, engine off, letting the silence press against his eardrums until it hurt. Twice he thought he caught the edge of something, 3 notes sliding together like wet silk, but the sound slipped away before he could fix it in place. On the 7th night he parked at the end of a washed-out logging trace and walked in with nothing but a flashlight, a .38 on his hip, and a voice recorder running in his shirt pocket. The beam cut pale tunnels through the laurel, and every step felt watched. Somewhere ahead the spring waited, patient as a grave, and Crow could almost feel the mountain measuring his stride, deciding whether he was man number 36 or something else entirely. Crow's flashlight trembled, then steadied as he forced himself to breathe through his mouth so the cloying sweetness wouldn't crawl down his throat. The beam cut across the Springhouse again and froze on what he had taken for shadows at first, men, or what the water had left of them. They knelt in a loose semicircle facing the pool, skin glowing faintly the way deep-sea creatures glow when the world has forgotten light. 34 bodies, heads bowed, palms open on their thighs like worshippers waiting for communion. Their ribs rose and fell in perfect synchrony, one lung shared among them all. Closer to the water, the change was worse. Bellies distended, stretched drum-tight and veined with black, moved with slow, deliberate pulses. From some of those bellies small hands pressed outward, fingers splayed against the inside of the skin as though testing the walls of a womb that had grown tired of waiting. One man, Crow recognized him from a missing poster, Tommy Riggins, 29, last seen buying red men at a Shell station, cradled something against his chest. It nursed with soft, wet sounds, a pale child thing no bigger than a possum, hair already long and black, eyes wide and ancient. When it lifted its head the face was the sister's face, miniaturized, perfect, hungry. The triplets themselves stood waist-deep in the spring, unmoving, water lapping at their hips like a tame dog. Their dresses clung transparent, revealing nothing and everything. They watched Crow with identical calm, the way a spider watches a fly already tangled. The one in the center raised her chin a fraction and the other 2 mirrored it exactly, a ripple delayed by nothing, not even breath. When she spoke the sound came from all 3 mouths at once, layered so tightly it felt like a single voice poured through 3 throats. "You're late, Harlan." The name struck him between the eyes. He had told no one he was coming here, not the sheriff, not the clerk at the motel, not even the waitress who poured his coffee that morning. Yet they knew him the way the mountain knows a stone that finally rolls home. Behind the sisters the water darkened, thickened, began to rise in slow coils that defied gravity, climbing the walls like ivy made of liquid night. The kneeling men did not flinch when it touched their knees, their thighs, their swollen bellies. They only leaned forward, eager, mouths opening in silent welcome. Crow's hand found the butt of the .38 but the metal felt warm, almost feverish, as though it had been lying in sunlight instead of strapped to his hip in March cold. The nearest sister extended one pale arm, palm up, water streaming from her fingers in perfect silence. The invitation was gentle, ancient, inevitable. Somewhere inside the rising black tide he thought he heard his own heartbeat slow to match the rhythm of the spring, and the flashlight slipped from his numb fingers, spinning once before it struck the stone and went dark. The only man who ever crawled out was number 29, Caleb Rhea, a pipeline welder from Fort Smith who had vanished the previous October. They found him 3 weeks after Harlan Crow's Tacoma was discovered parked neat as a church shoe at the end of Wolf House Road, keys in the ignition, recorder still running in the empty cab. Caleb came staggering down the mountain at dawn, naked, skin mottled with bruises shaped like fingerprints, belly grotesquely swollen and veined like marble. He collapsed on the porch of the first house he reached, an old widow's place outside Marble Falls, and would not stop screaming until they wrapped him in quilts and shot him full of enough Thorazine to quiet a horse. When he could finally speak, the words came in broken pieces, as if something inside him had been shattered and glued back wrong. He talked about the spring tasting like pennies and lilacs, about the sisters laying him down on warm stone while their voices braided around his spine and pulled. He said the water went into him the way roots go into soil, slow and patient, rewriting everything it touched. He remembered hands, dozens of hands, some his own, stroking the curve of his stomach while it grew, remembered the weight of new life kicking inside him like a trapped animal trying to chew its way out. He remembered the others kneeling around him, eyes soft with love, singing him through the pain the way mothers sing through labor. Worst of all, he remembered the moment something looked out through his own eyes and smiled with his mouth at the sight of the triplets waiting. That was when he understood the men weren't being killed. They were being kept. Married. Made useful. The children, pale, black-haired, always 3, needed fathers who would never leave, fathers whose bodies could be opened and filled and opened again each blood moon cycle. Caleb wept when he described the sound the newborns made the first time they tasted air, a 3-note chord that was also a name. He begged the doctors to cut it out of him, whatever was moving under his skin. They sedated him instead. That night the hospital's security cameras caught 3 identical women in the hallway outside his room, barefoot, dresses dripping, faces hidden by wet hair. The footage glitched for exactly 9 seconds. When it cleared, the bed was empty, sheets still warm, monitors flatlined. The only thing left was a damp handprint on the window glass, too high for any nurse to reach, and the faint smell of moonflowers drifting down the corridor long after the doors were locked and the lights turned off. The 35 were never the harvest, they were the hinge. Long before the first stone of the Springhouse was set, something older than the limestone slept beneath the ridge, coiled around the root of the world. It had been sung to silence once, bound by people who understood that some appetites must be starved rather than fed. The triplets' bloodline was the compromise the mountain made with itself, 3 daughters every generation to keep the sleeper dreaming, 3 voices to braid the lullaby tighter, 3 bodies to carry just enough of the darkness that the rest stayed buried. But lullabies weaken. Blood thins. The sleeper learned patience the way glaciers learn patience, and it taught the daughters a different song. Each man who drank from the spring gave more than seed. He gave resonance. 35 male heartbeats, tuned to the same low note, formed the final chord needed to crack the seal. The children born in the black water were not human offspring, they were shards. Splinters of the thing beneath, dressed in soft skin and midnight hair so they could walk unnoticed among daylight people. Every birth pushed the boundary outward a finger's breadth. Every pale daughter who learned to smile with her father's eyes carried a piece of the mountain into the world and left a hole for the mountain to follow. They were already loose. 3 little girls seen on the Buffalo River Trail at dusk, barefoot, asking lost hikers for water in voices that made grown men kneel and weep. A newborn left on a church step in Jasper whose cry came in perfect tritone and shattered every stained glass window from the inside. A trio of identical teenagers hitchhiking Highway 7, gone from the back seat the instant the driver blinked, leaving only wet handprints on the upholstery and a smell like deep caves after rain. Each carried the same quiet hunger, the same ancient patience wearing a child's face. The spring itself began to travel. New pools opened overnight in pastures, in culverts, in the cracked foundations of abandoned houses, black mirrors that reflected no stars. Cattle that drank grew heavy with wrong calves and had to be shot before they burst. Dogs refused to cross certain creeks. Cell phones caught fragments of 3-part harmony in the static between stations, and listeners found themselves driving east without remembering why. The mountain was loosening its grip on the secret 1 inch at a time, and every inch bled darkness into the lowlands. When the next blood moon rose, the 36th since the binding, the hinge would swing wide. The Springhouse would overflow, not with water but with night shaped like daughters. They would walk out smiling, hundreds of them, soft-footed and sweet-voiced, looking for new fathers, new mothers, new wombs to borrow. And behind them the ridge itself would open, slow as a mouth waking from centuries of fasting, ready to take back what had always been promised. The triplets stood at the rim now, barefoot, patient, almost tender, listening to the mountain breathe their names for the last time before it learned to speak with 1,000 borrowed tongues.